The afternoon sun beat down on the quiet suburban street as a moving truck pulled away from the curb. Standing on the front lawn of his new home, Andrew wiped the sweat from his brow and took a moment to just stare at the house. It wasn't perfect. The paint was peeling in spots, the gutters needed cleaning, and the flower beds were overgrown. But it was his. Every imperfection, every creaky floorboard, every outdated fixture now belonged to him. After 10 years of grinding at his engineering job, saving every extra penny, and passing up vacations that his co-workers took without a second thought, Andrew had finally done it. At 34, he had become a homeowner. He walked up the cracked concrete driveway, feeling the uneven surface beneath his feet. Several large cracks had formed over the years, with weeds pushing through like tiny green fingers reaching for the sky. The previous owners had clearly neglected this part of the property, probably put off by the cost of replacing it. But Andrew wasn't one to shy away from projects. In fact, he loved the idea of making this house truly his own, one improvement at a time. First things first, he mumbled to himself, pulling out his phone to snap some pictures of the driveway. The whole thing needed to go, not just for looks, but for safety too. The last thing he wanted was for someone to trip and get hurt, especially once winter came with its ice and snow. That evening, Andrew sat at his kitchen table, well, a folding table that would have to serve as a kitchen table until he could afford proper furniture, surrounded by boxes labeled KTCHN in thick black marker. His laptop glowed in the dimly lit room as he researched local contractors, comparing reviews and prices. Driveway Pros, 4.7 stars, 15 years in business. He read aloud, scrolling through pictures of before and after transformations. Might be worth getting a quote. The next morning, he called 3 different companies. The first couldn't fit him in for at least 6 weeks. The second seemed perfect until they quoted a price that made Andrew's eyes water. But the third, Reliable Concrete Solutions, checked all the boxes: reasonable price, availability within the next week, and excellent reviews from other homeowners in the area. "We can start Monday if that works for you," said the friendly voice on the other end of the line. Monday would be perfect, Andrew replied, feeling a little burst of excitement about his first real home improvement project. Over the weekend, Andrew unpacked what he could and made lists of everything else that needed fixing. The bathroom sink dripped constantly. The backyard fence had a section that was practically horizontal. The kitchen cabinets were from a bygone era. But there was something deeply satisfying about having these problems to solve in a place that belonged to him. Sunday night, he could barely sleep, not just because his mattress was still on the floor without a bed frame, but because tomorrow marked the beginning of transforming this house into his vision. He'd taken the morning off work to meet with the contractors and get everything started right. When Monday finally arrived, Andrew was up before his alarm. He put on a pot of coffee and stood by the front window, watching the street come alive with morning activity. Neighbors backed out of their driveways, heading to work. Kids waited at the corner for the school bus. A woman walked her golden retriever past his house, not even glancing up at the new neighbor watching from the window. At exactly 8:00 a.m., a truck with Reliable Concrete Solutions, painted on the side, pulled up. 2 men got out, followed by a larger truck carrying equipment. Andrew stepped outside, hand extended in greeting, a smile spread across his face. "Morning, ready to get started?" asked the lead contractor, a weathered man with calloused hands and friendly eyes. "More than ready," Andrew replied, his voice betraying his excitement. "This driveway has seen better days." As the crew began setting up and marking off the area, Andrew felt a sense of pride wash over him. Each crack they would repair, each section they would replace, was another step toward making this house truly his home. Little did he know that his simple driveway project was about to become much more complicated than he ever could have imagined. The jackhammer rode to life, breaking the morning quiet of the peaceful suburban street. Andrew watched with satisfaction as the crew began demolishing his old, cracked driveway. Chunks of concrete flew as the workers methodically made their way across the surface. It was loud and messy, but it was progress. "Should take about 3 days total," the lead contractor shouted over the noise. 1 for demolition, 1 to prepare the foundation, and 1 to pour and finish. Andrew nodded, already imagining how much better the house would look with a smooth new driveway. He was taking photos with his phone to document the before and after when he noticed movement from the corner of his eye. A woman with highlighted blonde hair styled in an expensive-looking bob was marching across the street, her face pinched with determination. She wore pressed khaki pants and a polo shirt with some kind of country club logo on the chest. Everything about her screamed neighborhood watch captain, not the official kind, but the self-appointed type. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut through the construction noise. "What do you think you're doing?" The contractor paused the jackhammer, and an uncomfortable silence fell over the property. Andrew stepped forward with a friendly smile, extending his hand. "Good morning. I'm just having my driveway replaced. Sorry about the noise, but it should only be for a few days." The woman ignored his outstretched hand, her eyes flicking from Andrew to the workers and back again. She crossed her arms tightly against her chest. "This is the Thompsons' house," she said flatly. "I know the Thompsons, and you're not them." Andrew's smile faded slightly, but he kept his tone pleasant. "The Thompsons sold the house. I'm the new owner, just moved in this weekend." The woman's eyebrows shot up, and she gave a small, disbelieving laugh. "Really? You bought this house? This isn't some kind of rental situation." Something cold settled in Andrew's stomach. He'd dealt with this kind of thinly veiled prejudice before, the disbelief that he could afford to live in a nice neighborhood, the assumption that he didn't belong. "Yes, ma'am. I purchased the home last month, closed on Friday, and got the keys that afternoon." His voice remained steady despite the growing tension. The woman, who still hadn't introduced herself, looked him up and down, taking in his casual t-shirt and jeans. The workers had stopped pretending to work and were watching the interaction with uncomfortable expressions. "Well, I find that hard to believe," she said finally. "The Thompsons didn't mention selling too. Well, they would have told me if they were selling." "I don't know what to tell you," Andrew replied with a shrug. "But this is my house now. Would you like to see my paperwork? I have the closing documents inside." Instead of responding, the woman pulled out her phone from her designer purse. Her acrylic nails clicked against the screen as she dialed. "What are you doing?" Andrew asked, though he already had a sinking feeling he knew the answer. "I'm calling the police," she announced loudly, as if proud of taking action. "There's a man destroying property on Oakwood Drive. The Thompsons' driveway is being ripped up by strangers." Andrew felt his heartbeat quicken. He'd heard too many stories that started exactly like this. A black person simply existing in a space where someone thought they didn't belong, followed by a call to the police that could quickly spiral out of control. "Ma'am, please," one of the contractors stepped forward. "We have a permit for this work. This gentleman is the homeowner." She held up a finger to silence him as she spoke into the phone. "Yes, I'd like to report potential vandalism and unauthorized construction." "No, I don't know him. The homeowners are the Thompsons. They're a nice family. They've lived here for years." Andrew took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. This was his property. He had every right to be here. He had documentation. Still, he felt the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. The other workers exchanged glances, clearly unsure whether to continue working or wait. The lead contractor approached Andrew quietly. "Want us to keep going or wait till this gets sorted?" Andrew looked at the half-demolished driveway, then at the woman still emphatically describing him to the police dispatcher on the phone. She was now gesturing wildly toward his house, her voice carrying across the quiet street. A couple of other neighbors had come out to their porches, watching curiously. "Let's pause for a bit," Andrew said finally. "Better to straighten this out first." And so they waited, the morning sun climbing higher in the sky, as police sirens wailed in the distance, growing steadily louder as they approached the home Andrew had been so proud to call his own just hours before. Two police cruisers pulled up to the curb, their lights flashing but sirens now silent. Andrew stood by his half-demolished driveway, hands visible at his sides, a habit he'd learned growing up. The construction crew had moved to stand near their truck, uncomfortable witnesses to the unfolding scene. The woman, who Andrew had now heard refer to herself as Mrs. Blackwell while talking to dispatch, looked smug as she watched the officers approach. Her arms were crossed over her chest, and she nodded slightly as if to say, "I told you so." A tall officer with a buzz cut stepped out first, followed by his partner, a shorter woman with her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. Their hands rested casually near their belts, but at least they weren't on their weapons. Small mercies, Andrew thought. "Good morning," the male officer said, his voice neutral. His name tag read Officer Reynolds. "We got a call about unauthorized construction." Andrew took a slow breath. "Officers, I'm Andrew Wilson. I just bought this house and moved in this weekend. I hired this company to replace my driveway." He emphasized the word "my" slightly. Mrs. Blackwell stepped forward immediately. "These people just showed up today and started tearing things up. The Thompsons have lived here for years. They would have told the neighbors if they were selling." Officer Reynolds turned to her. "And you are?" "Diane Blackwell. I've lived across the street for 15 years. I know everyone in this neighborhood." The female officer, whose tag read Officer Patel, stepped toward Andrew. "Sir, do you have any proof of ownership you could show us?" Andrew nodded. "I have all my closing documents inside. My ID has a different address because I just moved in, but I can show you everything." "That would be helpful," Officer Patel said with a slight smile that seemed meant to ease the tension. Andrew moved toward his front door, conscious of 4 sets of eyes on his back. He'd done nothing wrong, yet his heart pounded as if he were guilty of something. Inside, he quickly grabbed the folder of closing documents from his still unpacked boxes and returned to the driveway. He handed the folder to Officer Patel, who began reviewing the papers while Officer Reynolds kept an eye on the overall situation. Several more neighbors had emerged from their homes, watching from a distance. "This all seems in order," Officer Patel said after a moment. "The deed transfer is dated last Friday. There's the notary stamp and everything." Mrs. Blackwell stepped closer, her face showing disbelief. "Let me see that." She reached for the papers. Officer Reynolds stepped between them. "Ma'am, these are private documents. We'd verified them, and everything checks out." "But the Thompsons," she began. "Sold their house legally to Mr. Wilson here," Officer Reynolds finished for her. "People sell houses all the time, ma'am." The lead contractor cleared his throat. "Officers, we also have all the proper permits for this work." He held up a folder of his own. "City approved everything last week." Officer Patel reviewed these documents as well and handed them back with a nod. "Everything's in order here too." Mrs. Blackwell's face had turned an interesting shade of red. "Well, nobody informed the neighborhood association about this sale. We have a right to know who's moving in." Officer Reynolds sighed slightly. "Ma'am, homeowners don't need permission from the neighborhood association to sell their property, unless there are deed restrictions, which doesn't appear to be the case here. So I'm free to continue with my driveway replacement?" Andrew asked, keeping his voice level despite the anger and embarrassment burning inside him. "Absolutely," Officer Patel confirmed. "This is your property, Mr. Wilson. You're well within your rights to improve it." Mrs. Blackwell made a huffing sound. "Well, there are noise ordinances in this neighborhood. They can't just make this racket all day. Construction is permitted between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. on weekdays," Officer Reynolds said, clearly growing tired of the conversation. "Is there anything else we can help with today?" Mrs. Blackwell looked like she wanted to say more, but instead turned on her heel and marched back across the street to her own house, throwing one last glare over her shoulder. As the officers prepared to leave, the lead contractor approached Andrew. "Want us to get back to work?" he asked quietly. Andrew nodded, relief washing over him now that the immediate tension had passed. But as the officers drove away and the jackhammer roared back to life, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Mrs. Blackwell was still watching from her living room window, phone in hand, and the message was clear. She didn't think he belonged here, paperwork or not. One of the contractors caught his eye and gave him a sympathetic look. He was an older man with gray hair peeking out from under his hard hat. When the noise paused briefly, he walked over to Andrew. "Hey, can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked, gesturing for Andrew to follow him to the side of the house. Andrew followed the older contractor to the side of the house, away from Mrs. Blackwell's prying eyes. The man removed his hard hat and wiped sweat from his forehead with a bandana he pulled from his back pocket. Deep lines etched his weathered face, telling stories of decades under the sun. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything," the contractor began, his voice low. "But that lady across the street, this isn't my first time dealing with her." Andrew raised his eyebrows. "You've worked in this neighborhood before?" The man nodded, a wry smile crossing his face. 7 years ago, actually. Right here, on this exact same driveway. Wait, what? Andrew's full attention was now on the contractor. Yep. I replaced this very driveway for the Thompsons. It's why the boss sent me on this job. Thought it'd be simple since I'd done it before. He shook his head. Concrete shouldn't have cracked this badly after just 7 years, but they must have gone with the cheaper mix we recommended against. Andrew crossed his arms, processing this information. So you're saying you've met Mrs. Blackwell before? Oh yeah. The contractor chuckled without humor. But back then, she was bringing out lemonade and cookies for the crew. Had a whole different attitude. Let me guess, Andrew said, the pieces falling into place. The Thompsons were white. The contractor nodded slowly. Nice folks, but yes, they were. And Mrs. Blackwell treated us like we were doing God's work, replacing that driveway. Today, she acts like we're tearing up the Sistine Chapel. A cold feeling settled in Andrew's stomach, confirming what he already knew. The issue had never been about construction permits or neighborhood notifications. It was about him, about the color of his skin in a neighborhood where Mrs. Blackwell thought he didn't belong. I'm real sorry about this, the contractor said, genuine regret in his voice. It's not right, what she did. Just wanted you to know her problem isn't with the construction. And if she gives you any more trouble while we're here, just say the word. My guys and I have your back. Andrew extended his hand. Thanks. I appreciate that more than you know. They shook, and the contractor placed his hard hat back on. All right, let's get back to making you a proper driveway. One that'll last longer than 7 years, I promise you that. As they walked back to the front, Andrew noticed a young couple watching from next door. When they saw him looking, the woman waved hesitantly, and then both of them walked over. Hi there, the woman said. I'm Lily, and this is my husband Ray. We live next door. She gestured to the blue house on the right. Anda, he replied, shaking their hands. Just moved in. We saw what happened, Ray said, lowering his voice. With Mrs. Blackwell and the police. Not exactly the welcome wagon you were hoping for, I bet. Lily shook her head, clearly embarrassed. We want you to know that most people in this neighborhood aren't like her. Mrs. Blackwell is. She searched for a diplomatic word. Challenging. That's one way to put it, Ray muttered. Andrew couldn't help but smile at their awkward attempt to distance themselves from their neighbor's behavior. Thanks for coming over. It's nice to meet some friendly faces. We're having a small barbecue this weekend, Lily offered. Nothing fancy, just a few neighbors. You should come. It would be a proper welcome to the neighborhood. The invitation surprised Andrew, but in a good way. I'd like that. Thanks. As they chatted about the neighborhood, the best local restaurants, which days the garbage was collected, which neighbors had the loudest dogs, Andrew felt some of the tension from earlier begin to dissolve. Mrs. Blackwell was still watching from her window, but now he knew she didn't represent everyone on the street. When his new neighbors left and the construction crew resumed work, Andrew went inside to make some lunch. While making a sandwich, he noticed a stack of mail that had been delivered to the previous owners but never forwarded. He flipped through it, intending to write return to sender on everything, when a legal-looking envelope caught his eye. It was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Thompson from the county courthouse. Curious, Andrew set it aside. He wasn't going to open someone else's mail. That was illegal, but the courthouse return address, combined with what he'd just learned about Mrs. Blackwell, made him wonder if there was more to the story between her and the previous owners. After lunch, he went to his laptop and began searching public records for the Thompsons and their history with the property. What he discovered made his eyes widen in surprise. Night had fallen by the time Andrew finished setting up his home office. Cardboard boxes were pushed against the wall, and his computer desk, one of the few pieces of furniture he'd brought from his old apartment, sat by the window. Despite the confrontation earlier, he'd managed to get a lot done. The contractors had made good progress on the driveway, finishing all the demolition work and preparing the area for tomorrow's concrete pour. As he connected his computer, Andrew's mind kept drifting back to the courthouse letter and the online search he'd started. Public records had revealed something interesting. The Thompsons had been involved in 3 separate legal disputes with Mrs. Blackwell over the past 5 years. The details weren't fully available online, but the case numbers and filing dates were there for anyone to see. What were you two fighting about? Andrew muttered, clicking through another page of property records. A notification popped up on his screen, an email from his real estate agent. She had forwarded him a message from the Thompsons' agent with information the previous owners thought might be useful: the name of their lawn service, where to find the water shut-off valve, and instructions for the quirky garage door opener. At the end of the email was a folder of home-related documents the Thompsons had scanned for him. Most were user manuals and warranty information, but one PDF caught his eye: property line survey and fence dispute. Andrew opened it, and his eyes widened. The file contained correspondence between the Thompsons and their lawyer, along with a professional property survey and several dated photos. He quickly realized he was looking at documentation of a boundary dispute with, no surprise, Mrs. Blackwell. According to the survey, when Mrs. Blackwell installed a new fence 3 years ago, she had encroached nearly 2 feet onto the Thompsons' property along the side yard. The photos show the incorrect fence placement, with measurements clearly marked by the surveyor. What followed was a series of increasingly tense letters. The Thompsons had politely asked Mrs. Blackwell to move the fence. She had refused, claiming the survey was wrong. They had offered to split the cost of a new survey. She had threatened to sue them for harassment. Finally, the Thompsons had taken the matter to small claims court, and won. So that's why she's been watching this house like a hawk, Andrew said to himself. She has history here. As he continued reading, he found noise complaints filed by Mrs. Blackwell against the Thompsons for a birthday party that allegedly violated noise ordinances. The case had been dismissed when the Thompsons provided evidence that the party ended by 9 p.m. on a Saturday, well within legal hours. There was also documentation of a dispute over a tree that straddled their property line. Mrs. Blackwell had trimmed branches that hung over her yard, which was her right, but had done so in a way that damaged the tree, which was legally owned by the Thompsons. Andrew leaned back in his chair, processing everything. Mrs. Blackwell wasn't just a racist neighbor who had profiled him on site. She was a long-time troublemaker who had been feuding with the previous owners for years. The fact that the Thompsons were white hadn't protected them from her meddling, though it had certainly changed her approach. He glanced at the courthouse letter still sitting on his desk, unopened. Given what he now knew, it probably contained information about one of these disputes. He scribbled "Return to sender," no longer at this address, on the envelope and set it aside to mail tomorrow. A text message buzzed on his phone. It was from Ray next door. "Hey neighbor, just checking if Sat at 4 works for the BBQ. Bringing anything is optional, but your presence is mandatory. Also, heads up, we invited most of the street except you-know-who." Andrew smiled and texted back a confirmation. Then he pulled up the property records again, focusing on the boundary survey. The more he knew about the property and his rights, the better prepared he'd be if Mrs. Blackwell tried anything else. The sound of a car door slamming drew his attention to the window. Outside, under the glow of a street lamp, he spotted Mrs. Blackwell talking to someone in another neighbor's driveway, gesturing animatedly toward his house. The other person seemed to be trying to end the conversation, backing toward their front door as Mrs. Blackwell continued talking. "Looks like someone's spreading the news about the new neighbor," Andrew murmured. But instead of feeling anxious, he felt a strange sense of calm. Now that he understood the bigger picture, Mrs. Blackwell seemed less intimidating and more predictable. He turned back to his computer, opening a new search tab. It was time to learn everything he could about the neighborhood association she had mentioned earlier. If Mrs. Blackwell wanted to play games, Andrew was more than ready to know all the rules. The fresh concrete of Andrew's new driveway gleamed in the afternoon sun as he carried a bowl of homemade potato salad across his front lawn. 2 days had passed since the confrontation with Mrs. Blackwell, and the contractors had finished their work ahead of schedule. They'd done an excellent job. The smooth surface was a massive improvement over the cracked mess it replaced. As Andrew approached Ray and Lily's backyard, he could hear music playing and the sounds of conversation and laughter. The smell of grilling meat made his stomach growl. He'd been so busy unpacking and organizing his new home that he'd barely had time for proper meals. "There he is," Ray called out, waving a spatula from his position at the grill. "Man of the hour." Andrew felt a moment of self-consciousness as several faces turned toward him, but the warm smiles that greeted him quickly eased his worry. Ray introduced him around the small gathering, about a dozen neighbors of various ages. There was an older couple who had lived on the street for 30 years, a single dad with twin boys who looked to be about 10, a young couple who had just had their first baby, and several others. "Everyone, this is Andra, our newest neighbor," Ray announced. "He's already got the nicest driveway on the block, so clearly he's going to raise our property values." Everyone laughed, and Andra felt himself relax a little more. He set his potato salad on the table with the other dishes and accepted a cold drink from Lily. "So, Andra," said the older woman, whose name was Betty, "what made you choose our little neighborhood? We're not exactly the trendiest spot in town." "Actually, it was the trees," Andra admitted. "I grew up in an apartment building with almost no green space. When I saw all these big oaks and maples lining the street, I just fell in love with the place." Betty beamed. "My husband and I planted some of those trees 40 years ago. The city gave out saplings as part of a beautification project." The conversation flowed easily after that. Andra learned about the history of the neighborhood, which had originally been built in the 1950s for returning veterans. He heard stories about the annual block party every 4th of July, the unofficial pet parade that happened every Halloween when people walked their costumed dogs and cats around the block, and which houses gave out the best candy to trick-or-treaters. No one mentioned Mrs. Blackwell directly, but Andrew noticed a few knowing glances exchanged when he talked about his first day in the new house. It was clear that her behavior was well known. "Some of us saw the police cars," the single dad, Ben, finally said during a quiet moment. "Wanted to come over and say something, but..." He glanced at his sons playing nearby. "I wasn't sure what was happening and had the boys with me." Andrew nodded. "I understand." "It wasn't right, what she did," Betty said firmly. "Howard and I have watched her pull similar stunts for years. Used to be she just complained about lawn care and parking, but lately she's gotten more aggressive. Especially with new folks moving in," added the young mom, bouncing her baby gently. "She called animal control on our cat for trespassing in her yard the week we moved in. Now Whiskers isn't even allowed outside." One by one, neighbors shared their own stories about Mrs. Blackwell, how she photographed minor rule violations, reported people to the HOA for unapproved paint colors, and once called the fire department about a perfectly legal backyard fire pit. "The thing is," Ray said, lowering his voice, "she's on the HOA board. Only 3 people ran for 5 positions last election, so she got on by default. Gives her just enough power to be a real headache." Andrew took a sip of his drink, thinking, when's the next election? 3 months from now, Howard, Betty's husband, replied. "Why? You thinking of running?" Before Andrew could answer, a hush fell over the gathering. He turned to see what everyone was looking at and spotted Mrs. Blackwell standing at the edge of Ray's property, her arms crossed, staring directly at the party. "Is that a gathering of more than 10 people?" she called out loudly. The neighborhood bylaws clearly state that events with more than 10 attendees require prior notification to adjacent properties. Ray sighed and set down his spatula. "Here we go again." But instead of looking annoyed, most of the neighbors seemed amused. Betty even winked at Andra. "Watch this," she whispered. "We've gotten pretty good at handling her." A month had passed since the driveway incident, and Andra's house was finally beginning to feel like home. Boxes were unpacked, furniture arranged, and pictures hung on walls. The new driveway had cured perfectly, and he'd added potted plants on either side of his front door, small touches that made the place his own. As he watered his new plants early one Saturday morning, he noticed unusual activity up and down the street. Neighbors were setting up tables on their front lawns and arranging items for display. Ray came jogging by and stopped when he saw Andra. "Don't tell me you forgot about the neighborhood yard sale," he said with a grin. "First Saturday in June every year. It's in the welcome packet Lily gave you." Andra laughed. "Must have missed that. I haven't had much to sell anyway, just been focused on buying stuff for the house." "Well, come browse around later. Betty makes amazing lemonade, and the Wilson kids set up a cookie stand every year." Ray continued his jog with a friendly wave. Later that morning, the street was transformed. Families chatted across lawns, strangers walked from table to table examining items for sale, and children raced up and down the sidewalks. The atmosphere was festive, more like a block party than a simple yard sale. Andrew walked the length of the street, stopping to chat with neighbors he'd met at the barbecue and introducing himself to others he hadn't yet met. He bought a vintage lamp from Betty and Howard, a set of gardening tools from another neighbor, and, true to Ray's word, lemonade and cookies from the neighborhood kids. Notably absent from the festivities was Mrs. Blackwell. Her house stood like a fortress among the celebration, curtains drawn, no table on her lawn. But Andrew knew she was home, had glimpsed her peeking through her curtains earlier. As he approached his house with his purchases, he noticed someone had set up a table at the edge of his property. It was Ben, the single dad, and his twin boys. "Hope you don't mind," Ben called out. "Your corner gets the best visibility, and we're raising money for the boys' summer camp." "Not a problem at all," Andrew replied, stopping to look over their items, mostly outgrown sports equipment and video games. One of the twins, who'd been watching Andrew curiously, finally spoke up. "Are you really on the HOA board now? Dad said you got elected." Andrew smiled. "The election isn't for another 2 months, but I am running." "Mrs. Blackwell says you can't because you haven't lived here long enough," the other twin chimed in. "We heard her telling Mrs. Wilson at the mailbox." Ben looked embarrassed. "Boys, remember what we said about repeating conversations." "It's okay," Andrew assured him. "And Mrs. Blackwell is mistaken. I checked the bylaws carefully. There's no minimum residency requirement to run for the board, just home ownership." What Andrew didn't mention was that he'd been quietly building support among the neighbors for weeks. The HOA board had 5 positions, and 3 were up for election this cycle, including Mrs. Blackwell's. With Ray and Betty also planning to run, they had a real chance to reshape the board into something more positive and less punitive. "Mr. Andrew," one of the twins suddenly pointed down the street. "Look who's coming." Andrew turned to see Mrs. Blackwell marching toward his house, a piece of paper clutched in her hand. Her face was set in grim determination. "Here we go again," Ben muttered. But Andrew felt surprisingly calm. In the weeks since moving in, he'd thoroughly researched the HOA rules, gotten to know most of his neighbors, and even attended a town council meeting about community development. He was no longer an outsider. He was part of this neighborhood now. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackwell," he said pleasantly as she approached. "Beautiful day for a yard sale, isn't it?" "This," she thrust the paper toward him, "is a formal complaint. You've violated Section 7 of the Neighborhood Covenant by allowing commercial activity on your property without proper permission." Andrew glanced at Ben's yard sale table, then back at Mrs. Blackwell. Actually, Section 7 specifically exempts the annual neighborhood yard sale, including auxiliary tables on consenting. "Well, according to the property survey I had done last week, it appears to be about 20 inches onto my property line. I'm sure it was just an honest mistake when it was installed." The paper in Mrs. Blackwell's hand trembled slightly. This was clearly familiar territory for her, the same dispute she'd had with the Thompsons. "I'd be happy to discuss a timeline for having it moved," Andrew said, his voice still friendly but firm. "Or if you prefer, we can involve the same mediator who handled it last time." The twins watched with wide eyes as Mrs. Blackwell's face cycled through various shades of red. Several neighbors had stopped their yard sale activities to observe the confrontation. Finally, without another word, Mrs. Blackwell turned and walked stiffly back to her house. "That was awesome," one of the twins whispered. Ben looked at Andrew with newfound respect. "You handled that beautifully." Andrew shrugged. "I just did my homework." He looked around at the vibrant community activity on his street and smiled. "This is my home now. I plan to be here a long time." Down the street, Betty raised her lemonade glass in a silent toast to him. Nearby, Ray gave a thumbs up, and from other yards, Andrew caught approving nods and smiles from his new neighbors. The message was clear: he belonged here, no matter what Mrs. Blackwell thought. And together, they were building a community where everyone could feel welcome.